Today, every business is a digital business. Most of us are migrating workloads to the cloud, adopting DevOps tools, rolling out RPA software, and supporting a remote workforce. While opportunity is great, so is the risk of advanced cyber attacks. Many high-profile breaches start with a compromise of privileged credentials. CyberArk is the #1 leader in privileged access management. Talk to CyberArk today to secure privileged access for humans and machines across hybrid and cloud environments and on endpoints. Learn more at securityweekly.com/CyberArk and stay one step ahead of the attackers. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. We're looking for high-quality guest suggestions for all of our podcasts. To fill some Q3 recording slots, submit your suggestions by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review those monthly, sometimes more than monthly, and we'll let you know once they're reviewed. Greg Thomas is here with us. He practices offensive and defensive security. He spent 5 years in the Marines doing counterintelligence. Thank you for your service. And also speaks at B-Sides conferences about the need for diversity in InfoSec. Greg, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Nice to have you on today. Let's start with some of the healthcare stuff, because I am not familiar with HITRUST compliance at all. I had to Google it, to be honest with you. So I was hoping you could fill us in on HITRUST compliance versus security. Let's start there.
So I guess at a high level, if we want to talk about HITRUST, I would say it's the evaluation method in which making sure you're doing the things HIPAA says you should do is the best way to describe it at like the highest level. It's very comparable to PCI Dss in how they want you to segment data, have it encrypted at rest and at transit. I would say there's more paperwork, technical side stuff in terms of BAAs and being a authorized person that could actually make use of the data. There's a difference between being able to like hold data and then use data. And there's a lot more technical stuff around that as opposed to PCI, where it's just like, if you have those credit card information, if you're either a merchant or a vendor, it's right. One of those two things, versus when you're working in HIPAA with HIPAA and HITRUST, you could be a vendor, you could be a third-party business associate, you could be the actual practitioner that generates the data. There's so many different aspects of what you can use this data for, why you would use this data, do you have authorization to use the data, and all these things that definitely play a role in how you do HITRUST and how you actually implement that across your corporation.
Yeah, it's interesting that, so my wife works in healthcare, Matt's wife works in healthcare, and some of my neighbors work in healthcare, but you can say that and have like completely different perspectives, right? Like one of my neighbors works on the insurance side, right? And then when you're a doctor, that's a totally different perspective if you have your own practice or work in a hospital. And then, my wife works in diagnostic imaging. So like the threat modeling I do, well, you don't know I'm necessarily threat modeling, but I'm asking my wife, my neighbor's questions, and I'm doing the threat modeling in my head. And it is very different compared to PCI. We're worried about credit card transactions, right? But the interactions that happen in a healthcare system are far more complex. So when you were talking about HITRUST compliance being like a lot more aspects to it, I totally get that.
Yeah, definitely. So, and the threat modeling portion of it is, well, for one, I'm glad I don't work in a hospital in this capacity. Let's just put it that way, because of the because I would say when you're in a hospital, you're like the hub of a spoke of a wheel that has so many different points, from other doctors' offices to caseworkers to insurance company payers to third-party vendors like ours. You have so many places this data is going and is being used for wildly different purposes that you have to be able to manage that both on the paperwork side with your vendor agreements, your BAAs, knowing who has your data and where it's going. And then on top of that, working as a third party or BAA, making sure that you're not sharing data with other BAAs that haven't signed off on both you and your from the hospital or source of the data. So there's a lot to manage, at least out, not necessarily the technical side, because the implementation isn't really much far off from PCI Dss. It's more so of the paperwork around it and tracking everything and who has what and where.
Matt?
Yeah, there's a little bit of correlation also to Graham Leach Bliley, because I spent the early part of my compliance career managing third-party vendor management for one of the large national banks. Now, back then, it was very decentralized purchasing. I think there were like 70,000 vendors. My guess is that in a hospital environment, the number of third parties has to be enormous because there's so many different types of services being offered, and managing all those business agreements and making sure everybody's got a level of compliance with protecting the electronic health record, which is really what HIPAA was kind of focused on, it's got to be challenging.
Right. So from a third-party vendor perspective, you're taking from a bunch of hospitals, but you're really only necessarily signing like one BAA with each hospital. So you're pretty much like, we're going to take your data, we're going to protect it, we're going to use it for our purposes, boom, boom, boom. So you're done with that in turn. And then you have maybe other organizations that you may work with that maybe one or two one-offs, but outside of that, you really don't have to share the data you receive versus being in a hospital. Your data is really only becomes useful outside of the immediate context when you share it with other third parties and get information back from that data. So you have to manage all of these different relationships, all of these different vendor managements. You have to worry about not just you being breached, but any of your third parties being breached as well, because then that basically constitutes a breach on your data. So there's a whole myriad of concerns that you have to worry about doing HIPAA and HITRUST within a hospital environment that you don't have to worry about doing PCI as a merchant, doing PCI as a vendor. There's just so many different connections that you have to manage and worry about, that when you're doing HITRUST, that documentation is king. I mean, we say that all the time anyway, but I would truly say before you even contact someone to do your, your caps and to actually do your HITRUST assessment, that making sure you document exactly how you do things and exactly how your relationships are and how your data is not only used, but also farmed out. Having the documentation around that is so important.
Matt?
So when we think about PCI DSS and some of the downsides of how PCI DSS has been implemented, right? A lot of people would say, it's a checkbox mentality. People will treat PCI and the DSS as a checkbox and maybe not worry about the security aspects. Do you see some of the same challenges with HITRUST, and is HITRUST treated as more of a compliance checkbox versus getting really serious about security?
So when I was a consultant, at RSM, we had people for HIPAA and HITRUST and do assessments, and they tended to, I would say in 2015, it was a lot more checkboxing than I've heard about today. But definitely 2015, there was a lot of, especially in hospitals, it was definitely just go down the list. Are we doing this thing? Yes. But I would say HITRUST in it as the organization, and I would say the compliance side of people, the actual people that are coming to do the assessments, I feel like there's a lot less of that checking the box and more so of these assessors asking questions and going, well, how exactly are you doing that? Can we see the evidence for that? And even looking at it, and you have to provide a lot more evidence to be compliant now. So, and that was one of my biggest gripes with compliance in general, at least when I first got into the space, was that what I have to do for security far exceeded what I needed to do to be compliant. But I would say that compliance is now, it seems like it's actually catching up to what security should be and what it is in terms of using evidence and value and actually measuring your compliance, actually seeing like, okay, you're doing it, but are you actually getting any value out of it? I would say that measured part of it, as long as you have an assessor that has some sort of InfoSec background, that has seen these things before, it will be all right. It turns out it works out a lot better now than it used to be.
Greg, I've been reading a lot of articles with the global pandemic and the increased usage of telemedicine. I haven't really been impressed with the articles. They're like, oh, there's compliance and, data privacy concerns with telemedicine. I'm like, yeah, but okay. So how is that working today in a healthcare environment where we have these compliance mandates, we have to protect data, but now the patient and doctor communications is potentially going over the internet?
I would say that it also depends on the vendor. I mean, in terms of who's doing the telemedicine. So if it was developed in-house and the app is built with the proper protections that you would use with any sort of PHI or PII in general, that it should be all right. It's more so of, how we transfer data now using HL7s. That's pretty much like rsync with with strong encryption, and in terms of how we move data from hospitals and payers down to us and back and forth.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I find it interesting, the movement of data, because obviously I have access to people who work in healthcare, and I'm like, wait, where do my images go? How do you get my images from one machine to the other, and how do the various systems talk to each other? And I didn't realize that for things like medical imaging, for example, there's an entire IT and security team that's just dealing with the medical imaging piece, right? Moving those images between systems and getting them in front of doctors and the technicians who are doing the exams. Sorry.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts. If you're thinking about just medical imaging, you have to be able to get those images into an EHR. You have to be able to get those images. They may not be needed to seen by before they even get into an EHR. They may need to be seen by a doctor, so they have to be actually printed out. What happens to those physical copies? Where do those go? Because even though that seems more so of not an IT function, the actual physical copies of the medical imaging usually falls under security departments in hospitals of having to track that along with the actual data itself to make sure it's going where it needs to be.
Yeah, because I thought it was interesting, when you have a system like Epic is very popular, right? But then you've got the ultrasound Epic machine that's GE, and those images have to get transferred. So then, my first question, as an InfoSec person, I'm like, wait, how long do the images live on the actual scanning device, and are they archived off of there when the exam is done and put back into Epic? How does that? I'm sure that's stuff you deal with on a daily basis, right?
Thank God I don't. I actually, when I worked in the hospital, I was a nurse. So now I get to step back and work as a third-party vendor, and I just say, just give me the data and we'll do stuff to it.
Gotcha.
It's actually been really good to not
have to worry. Yeah, because I wouldn't want that headache. Because again, you have to know where your data lives, how long it lives there, and that's just one small part of a large hospital. You think about then all of the systems and devices and roles and who has access to it.
Yeah, if you think about all the medical devices from medical imaging devices, when you're doing CAT scans, how long do they live on a CAT scan machine? How long does what's the name? Insulin pump, an internal insulin pump that keeps all that data that's right there on your hip. How long does it save that? There's ones that actually transmit that data. Does it transmit it in the clear? Does it transmit it encrypted? How does it transmit it back to the doctor? There's hundreds of devices like that, from pacemakers, insulin pumps, and so you have to worry about how all that data gets into something, but then B, how all that data also gets out and doesn't get compromised. So when you're doing HITRUST, you have to document all of those things just so you can keep track of all of your agreements. Because a big part of HITRUST is, let's see your business agreements. Let's see your third-party vendor management stuff. Let's see how you track your data. I would say a third of it is not even technical stuff. It's more so, do you have the paperwork to back up that you know where your stuff is?
Yeah, the technical segment within HIPAA isn't that big when you look at the entire HIPAA regulation. There's a lot more on process and some of the other things. The technical control section in HIPAA is actually pretty small and very open to interpretation.
The technical controls are tiny. I think it's only 3 or 4 sections at most, versus I would say there's a good 4 or 5 about just what's your process for onboarding vendors? What's your process for protecting data through role-based access and onboarding and offboarding and all? There's so many different levels to just that and processes and making sure. That's another thing with HITRUST. is making sure your processes are rock solid. I mean, they are followed to the T. Everybody's on board with them. Everybody understands how they're done. Everybody understands what to do if there's an interruption in it or if there's a breakage somehow in that process, that people have a good enough understanding of said process to make adjustments, write them down, make these changes, put it through change management, all of that good stuff.
Are there things in there that talk about the integrity of the data as well? Because in a healthcare environment, as a patient, let's say, I'm very concerned about that. As I read about, attacks, again, going back to medical imaging, what if those images are being modified in transit or at rest, right? That can have very large implications for patient safety. And I've read about a couple of theoretical attacks and some stuff done in the lab. I've not read about an actual attack that was modifying the data. Usually when we talk about an attack against healthcare, it's ransomware, right?
I would say that there's so much that I would say that the possibility for that would probably happen if someone was being specifically targeted by a state actor. I'm just thinking about the high level of difficulty to A, get into a hospital system, B, specifically change medical imaging data on the fly.
Right.
So basically break encryption, grab it while it's in transit or at rest, and then make those changes and then not be picked up on by multiple medical professionals. You couldn't really do it at a large scale. So it would have to be done at a targeted person. And I struggle to think of a non-state actor that would have the capability to do that.
Right. No, I agree. I want to, Matt, if you didn't have any more questions on the HITRUST side or healthcare, I did want to transition to diversity and InfoSec. I have a lot of conversations about this topic, and I want to get your take, Greg, on some of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of, two aspects, really. One, comparison to other industries, which is interesting because I want to talk about healthcare, right? Because I feel like that doctors have really come a long way in diversity. And when, again, I talk to my wife and others in the healthcare profession, there is at least gender diversity, from what I understand, that has made inroads into the medical community. But if you look at some of the different disciplines, my wife works in sonography, very, very high degree of females. In fact, I don't know if there is even one male working in some of the departments. If so, there's like one out of 100. The other interesting aspect is the apprenticeship side. We see a kind of a loss of apprenticeship in a lot of the fields here in the U.S. Doctors have a very strong apprenticeship, program. Obviously, there's people's lives at stake. So I guess a two-part question: how can we learn from other industries that have achieved better diversity than InfoSec, and how do we explore the apprenticeship side of things?
Well, I guess I can give you a long answer. So I guess for the background. So when you and I first met, which was, I think, DEF CON in 2014, I was one of maybe 4 Black people I saw throughout the entire conference, total. I can remember, I saw Marcus Carey and a couple other people, and that was it. When I went in 2018, it was about 50 of us. So in that 4-year span, there was, a huge explosion of not just seeing people at conferences, but, seeing them online, seeing them at different organizational events, seeing them at different things. So even though it's something like 94% white guys in InfoSec, and then 4% white women, and then the rest is just everybody else. The last 2% is so minuscule, everybody else fits in that last 2%. And I could me personally see that it's growing. It's growing at a very small scale, but I mean, from 5 to 40 is a huge jump numerically, So to speak on apprenticeships, there are organizations you have Year Up that do from 18 to 24-year-olds, from minorities, from low-income neighborhoods. They basically send them to companies that sponsor them. And it works sort of like a paid internship. And they get exposure into application security, regular information security, defensive security, help desk work. They get an exposure to the broad range of what is across IT. And a lot of these kids end up getting hired by the companies they internship for, and they end up I had one guy, he's basically a senior security engineer, and I mentored him in 2015. And I mean, he's been on a meteoric rise because he got the opportunity, because the opportunities presented themselves and they were able to take it.
Yeah, I think apprenticeships have, if done correctly, can help the diversity issue in InfoSec and afford the people an opportunity to work in this field, right? Which we sorely need. And when we need people with the right experience, and an apprenticeship is a way to gain that experience in the field. You think about an electrician, right? Largely, that's a trade learned from apprenticeships, right? And they had built that into their programs.
Lockpicking too.
Lockpicking, yeah, locksmiths, exactly.
Yeah.
I would say that it boils down to not just the skills, but the perspective. I remember when I talked to Dave Kennedy in 2015 at Pci's Cleveland. Cleveland. We were speaking. He was speaking about when he went into Target and just walked out with a cash register. And I said, yeah, you could probably teach that to your guys at your team, because most of them are going to be white guys. They could pull that off. If I worked for you, I couldn't do that. I would have to approach that situation where I need to leave this Target with this cash register. I would have to do it in a different way. I would have to use a lot more social engineering. I would have to dress up, put on a suit, or put on what looks like a Target uniform and print fake business cards, because me being Black, people are going to ask more questions when I assert authority. So I have to craft a narrative that he necessarily didn't have to do. He just walked in and walked out with it. So it's more so of having that, being able to come at security from a different perspective and say, hey, with my lived experience, I know I have seen people do this. I have seen people do that. There's a value in being able to look at things from a source of lack, as in, if the barrier of entry to get into IT in general, you have to be able to afford a computer, internet connection, be able to take apart that computer sometimes. That costs money that a lot of people don't have. So if you're still trying to think, I need to steal something without having those resources, being able to turn those gears lets you think outside the box. And I would say definitely more of that is needed in information security, because the people who will steal data and all that, they're coming from that same space of lack.
Yeah, and we need to turn those people to the good side rather than the dark side, right? And give them the opportunity. I mean, we've seen that over time, especially in Eastern Bloc countries, right? A lot of folks turn to crime because there is no opportunity, right? And I think it's a similar problem in the U.S., creating that opportunity for everyone to fill that skills gap. And diversity is so important in our field, too. Just having people from different backgrounds and perspectives, the problems and challenges that we're dealing with, I think really lends itself to, you absolutely need that diversity.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the talks like Jason Street does about where he goes to different countries, the techniques he learns from those different hackers in these different countries on different continents are so wildly different in how they approach a problem than how we approach a problem, that you lose out when you don't have that. You really lose out.
And we're such a diverse industry anyways, right? I mean, if we think about all the different things in InfoSec, it's so broad that bringing in different perspectives and different skills help to solve different aspects of the InfoSec challenges that organizations face. Like you said, from Jason's perspective, it's all more on the social engineering side, but you've got the physical security aspects, all the way to all the technology stuff that we talk about on any given day too. Just very broad industry to have to deal with, and diversity helps across the whole spectrum.
Right, and it's all about training to look at things a different way, and some people have always had to look at things a certain way. So if you're like Dave Kennedy, you're like, well, I'm going to go through the front door. And for me, the front door is always closed, so I always have to think about where else can I go that isn't the front door. So if you have always had to think about that when you're approaching any sort of, security incident, whether you're doing you're red teaming or anything like that, as long as you're thinking, I can't go through the front door, it allows your brain to think about all the other possibilities, all the other doors and windows and ways to get in.
And it's that way of thinking, Greg, that we need people like that in this field, right? That have that way of thinking. And it's interesting when you look at the military and government history of recruiting cybersecurity professionals, they tried to recruit internally. And like it turns out, that's not so successful because one of the things we do as hackers is we go against social norms. And that's not a quality that was found in most people working in military and government, right? We need folks like you that are going to think differently and challenge the social norms and think differently about how to break into something, right? We need to be able to test for that. And so they developed an aptitude test that just tested for those set of skills. It turns out there's a lot of other industries that do the same thing. If you were a pilot, in the commercial space or got your pilot's license, if you're applying to the Air Force, like that means nothing. Basically, they test you and your aptitude, not the skills that you may have acquired before.
Right. And I would say there's a tendency so you have people who, when they were younger, they were 16 with the ear gauges and the nose ring. And they were like, I'm never going to join the military. Versus you have people like me that joined at 17 that became anti-society, in their 20s. So, it was my 20s where I grew up the long hair and everything else. So, and that, I guess, pulled me more towards the, a space of what jobs are there that allow me to be myself and still think for myself and appreciate my out-of-the-box thinking. And you pretty much land in IT with that kind of thought.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So you have a talk on hacking diversity. There's a link in the show notes. Are you doing any talks coming up?
I would love to if we could, the COVID is definitely ruining all of our plans for conferences and stuff like that. But I definitely plan on doing it in 2021. I definitely plan on submitting a more expanded version of that talk I've been working on for the past couple of years to conferences to speak at.
Awesome. Well, Greg, thank you so much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly.
No, thank you.
With that, we'll take a short break and come back with the last interview for this episode. Stay tuned.